Hello and welcome to the Rogers Brief. I'm Adam Rogers. Thank you for watching and thank you for listening. I'm going to talk today about Day 21 of the Mass Casualty Commission proceedings, which have just wrapped up and which featured mainly Michael Hallowes, who is an expert from England on emergency alert systems, their governance, their functionality, and some policy advice that he's given. Some good advice. He was a very interesting witness, I thought, today. And then I'm also going to revisit the issue of the death of Heather O'Brien and some of the conflicting evidence that we heard on that timeline. We heard from Constable Ian Fahey, and we've also heard from Corporal Dwayne Ivany, both of whom were on that scene and had conflicting accounts of what took place that day. So what I want to do is give you a sense of how I think a judge would approach that kind of evidence and try to reconcile some of the discrepancies. But first, just a few minutes on Michael Hallowes. Michael Hallowes was a retired police officer from England who was then the head of the Australian Emergency Alert System, helped develop it, and was leading that effort. And so also familiar with the Canadian system. He's done some consulting and some presentations in Canada on the emergency alert system that we have, the Alert Ready system, and also has done some work and is familiar with the system in England. So some good comparators for our system and some lessons to be learned there. One of the main things that he talked about was the governance of the system. And in Australia, it was led by the government, whereas in Canada, it was led by a private entity. A private company has created the Alert Ready system, which is then operated through governments, along with the CRTC. So that makes a difference in a few key respects. One is that in Canada, you have to be on a 4G network. Your phone needs to be on a 4G network in order to receive the emergency alerts, whereas in Australia, with the government-run and created system, anyone on a 3G phone, so an older phone, would be able to receive the alerts as well. And some of the data today suggested that probably 65% of Nova Scotians would not have access to a 4G network through their phones. So not a perfect system in terms of getting word out to the public. However, certainly much better than Twitter, which was used by the RCMP a little bit on the morning of the 19th of April as well. But, they had, I think, maybe 100,000 users, I'm not sure, or followers. I'm not sure they had that many at that time, but that's, even if they were all Nova Scotian followers, which they're not, and many would be even bots, that is still less than 10% of the population, probably even less than that as a percentage for rural parts of Nova Scotia. So I'd be interested to see the data on Twitter users in Cumberland, Colchester area. The other thing was, in Australia, it was as it was established and being developed, they did public education on how the system would work, and they did that much through the schools. So they would provide the information to students, who would then bring it home to their parents, explain it to the families. The other thing that they did was ensure that all public safety, any organization that had responsibility over public safety, would have direct access to be able to utilize the system, rather than having it centralized through an emergency management office as it is here in Nova Scotia. And so, and especially the police, so for ongoing active criminal situations, active shooter situations, the police would have access to that and be able to utilize the system. Now, related to that, the other key concept I thought Mr. Hallowes described today was the concept of subsidiarity. Subsidiarity in that context means that the lowest ranking supervising officer who is on the scene and who is closest to the action and is on the scene, whoever the ranking officer is among that crowd, should be able to provide make an alert happen, either issue an alert themselves or direct that an alert be issued immediately. So imagine in this situation, the night of the 18th of April, Stuart Basselt, Aaron Patton, and Adam Merchant are the first ones into Portapique. Constable Basselt was the acting corporal at that time, so the ranking officer. And he, at shortly after 11 p.m. that night, had radioed the thought that maybe an alert should go out to the public. Well, under the system as suggested by Mr. Hallowes and as it exists in other places, he would have been able to issue that alert at that time to phones in the local area at least. So an important concept, I think. And there was another note too that Heidi Stevenson the morning after on the 19th had suggested that some sort of report go out to the public or message to the public as well. She didn't specifically mention an emergency alert, but that may have been the case had she known about it, had they been told about it. But what we learned yesterday was that the RCMP effectively refused to learn about the system. It was presented to them in 2016. They were offered an opportunity to have direct access to the system, but they refused it, and then they didn't even have a protocol in place for how they would use it if the opportunity arose or if the situation necessitated that an emergency alert be issued. So the other thing that we heard about today from Michael Hallowes was the timeliness of it, and he described this as sort of a reverse 911 situation. So the alert would go out and you would expect people to get it right away. It's an urgent situation. Timeliness is important, and that they should take action accordingly in the same kind of a time frame you would expect. If you called 911, you would expect resources to be deployed immediately or urgently. And he described trying to work the time frame from the time you realize there's an emergency to the time an alert is issued down to 8 minutes. Now, what we heard yesterday of the system, how the protocol worked, there was 18 steps involved. 8 minutes, you're not going to take 18 steps in 18, you're not going to take 18 steps in 8 minutes. But that's the kind of time frame that Michael Hallowes would suggest should be the goal of a system like this, maybe even less than that. So those were important. We're going to hear more about this system tomorrow. There's going to be a round table. Michael Hallowes is going to be taking part in that. It's not quite clear what that's going to entail in terms of new information, but we'll hear some policy advice on that again tomorrow. So that's sort of those are some of the highlights of what Michael Hallowes had to say today. I think you'll hear next week when the RCMP are having their opportunity to speak that they'll try to undermine the potential utility of the system at the time, of the emergency alert system, that is. But it was still really the best tool that the RCMP had at that time to provide a warning to the public of what was happening, and they didn't even consider using it. So that was some very important testimony. I think you'll see some important recommendations coming out of that as well. So, okay, that's what I wanted to say about the alert system. And so now I want to switch topics and talk a little bit more about the death of Heather O'Brien. Now, this was on Plains Road near Debert. Miss O'Brien was shot by Gabriel Wortman, sitting alone in her car, Volkswagen. And we heard from Constable Ian Fahey, who was driving with his partner, Constable Devonna Coleman, and they were going into Debert, and they came upon the scene. Their Constable Fahey's testimony, we haven't heard testimony from Constable Coleman, although she has given a statement. Constable Fahey said that he arrived on the scene and provided what he called lethal overwatch. So he was providing cover for Constable Coleman, who went to check out Miss O'Brien in their vehicle. She indicated that her hands were too cold, and so she wasn't able to tell whether she was feeling a pulse or not, so they switched positions. Constable Fahey then checked, thought he felt a pulse, heard some noises emanating, and but then was tapped on the shoulder, he says, by Corporal Ivany, who took over the care. Now, Corporal Ivany says there was no such tap on the shoulder. He was the first one on the scene, he and his other partner, Jeff Mahar, and they are both EMERT, emergency medical officers, so police officers, but medically trained officers. And they had been involved the night before in Portapique, had been involved with Lisa Banfield, had gone to other scenes as well that morning, and had tried to treat some of the other victims. So there was some clear problems, contradictions with the two accounts. Another one was that, of course, Constable Fahey is saying, we took her pulse, we tried to treat her, I was about to take her out of the vehicle, but then Corporal Ivany says, well, no, the door was closed, we had to, I was going to break the passenger window, I look over and Mahar is breaking the driver's window, and then we checked on her. And then Corporal Ivany says he checked with his thumbs on Miss O'Brien's neck for a pulse, thought he felt something, was told by I think it's Constable Mahar, might be Corporal, that, make sure you do this properly, and so they checked her other vital signs and found nothing. So what would a judge do in the situation to try to suss out those two stories and figure out, what may have actually been the case? So Constable Fahey says, so the first thing is you look for neutral evidence, neutral verifiable evidence, and we have some of that. We have some radio broadcasts on specific times. We also have a report of the vehicle from Constable Kat Bazaire, who used to be stationed in Antigonish, who did reports of various crime scenes, and did a report of this Volkswagen. And then you compare the statements, and you see what you can make of those. So first thing is, we know that Constables Fahey and Coleman arrived at 10:15:37 because they arrive at the Jeddah because there was a radio broadcast at that point, and it's at paragraph 124, I recall, of the statement. He says that there was someone shot, and he says that over the radio. He also says he tried to put the car in park, and all of the things I've just said. Corporal Ivany was on the radio at 10:14:41, so about a minute prior to Fahey and Coleman's radio broadcast, saying "emert is," and then there's inaudible. Now, he was asked about that statement, and he says they were on the scene. That's what they were saying, that they were on the scene. So this is about a minute before the other broadcast. So it's like, well, they arrived on the scene, and then, within a minute, perhaps get to the vehicle. What Corporal Ivany described when he gets to the vehicle is that there was a male and female officer there providing lethal overwatch. So, okay, well, that's somewhat consistent. At least we have the right people that are there. He's not denying that anybody was present. All right, so we also have, of course, the GPS from Constable Fahey's vehicle, which confirms that they were on the scene. So though nobody's denying that they were there. We have Constable Bazaire's report when she indicates that the Volkswagen was next to the woods. So it makes sense. Then you look back and say, well, it makes sense that Constable Fahey had to put the vehicle in park. It wasn't still running. Nobody else talked about putting the vehicle in gear or doing anything else with the vehicle's gear at that point. The issue of the two front windows being broken would seem to tend to support Corporal Ivany's view, so we'll come back to that. But that the report of where the vehicle was, has some elements of both sides. Constable Coleman gave a statement as well. Her report was consistent with that of Constable Fahey, and they were the first two on the scene. Now, Constable Fahey's statement was made on October 1st of 2021, so certainly not immediate. Corporal Ivany gave a statement only in January of this year, so after the mass casualty was supposed to begin. So neither statement was particularly close in time to the events, so certainly there's an opportunity or a chance there that people will forget. You'd have to take that into account. Although Constable Fahey made some notes at the time too, which are consistent with what his other evidence and statement was. He describes, yes, the lethal overwatch, and then he notes, there's some notes in Constable Fahey's statement where he sees that Miss O'Brien was shot in the eye. And then in his statement, he suggests that they kind of backed off at that point and were more concerned for a moment, at least, about the potential that the killer was still in the area. And the implication from what he's saying there, although you can't quite tell because of the redacted, blacked out portions, is that the two officers were not going to take big risks at that time because he knew and he was quite sure that Miss O'Brien was already dead. Now, contrast this with Constable Fahey's statement earlier about his plan, his and Constable Coleman's plan, had they encountered the killer, which was to ram him, shoot him, risk themselves. And he says several times throughout his statement, and credibly so, I think, that he was prepared to risk his life, his safety for others and for the public. So that seems to suggest that he checked on Miss O'Brien and did all those things. Corporal Ivany's statement at page 61, he says the Volkswagen was off the road, so that's consistent. He says the two regular RCMP members were there, one male, one female. He did not believe anyone had checked on the female at that point, but in the statement, he never asked anybody. Okay, so he may think he was the first one on the scene, but when he arrived, perhaps there was nobody actively checking on Miss O'Brien at the time. So, it may be a fair but mistaken presumption on his part that he just never investigated. He said he spoke to the officers about a female, not Miss O'Brien specifically. He doesn't say. We can think that's who he's talking about. But again, this is a statement, almost 2 years later. He dealt with many elements of the crime scenes that night and that morning. So, certainly the possibilities there that he could be mixing some things up. And then the redacted portions of his statement on page 62 of his statement seem to suggest that Corporal Ivany saw a chest wound first and then started treating Miss O'Brien, thinking that, there may be an opportunity to save her. And then Mahar points out the injury to her eye, the shot to her eye that was certainly, one presumes, the mortal wound. And then he reconsidered. That is, Corporal Ivany reconsidered his earlier conclusion that he felt a pulse with his thumb. Then they checked the other spots, determined that she was deceased. So what he says on page 62 is interesting. He says, and I'll quote, "What he was seeing was that it didn't make sense that I was feeling a pulse from the nature of the trauma that he was observing." So that tells me that Mahar saw the shot to the eye. Ivany originally did not, and that dictated his initial reaction. The two versions can mostly be reconciled, except for two very sort of discrete points. One is Ivany tapping Fahey on the shoulder and saying, "I got this." Well, in the whole course of events, maybe that's a fairly minor thing to remember or forget. And then the other one is the driver's door being operable. And nobody asked anybody about this, but it was, who knows, if Fahey or Coleman slammed the door back after they treated, or if Corporal Ivany was simply mistaken about that. So I tend to prefer Constable Ivany's version. I think a judge would as well. That was really the one scene of intense drama that he dealt with, whereas Ivany dealt with many different scenes and I think would be more easily mixed up in some of his testimony. Then, with Corporal Ivany dealing with so many scenes, like I say, certainly easy for him to get things mixed up. Constable Coleman has given a statement. Mahar has not, and the commission is still seeking his out. So, Fahey and Coleman, their accounts are consistent with one another. Mahar's statement, we don't know what he might say, so we can't check on that. It seems consistent that with Constable Coleman's evidence that they checked Miss O'Brien for a pulse, and then Emert arrived and pulled her from the vehicle. So, difficult to reconcile these kinds of things. It's difficult when, seemingly people that believe their own story and present it in that fashion have directly contradictory evidence. Honest but mistaken belief, perhaps. Difficult to reconcile, but I think in this case there's enough there to have a sense of what really happened, that Fahey and Coleman did some treatment, were fairly soon after relieved by Corporal Ivney and Mahar, and then provided lethal overwatch while they were doing their work. But unfortunately, it seemed like from the beginning, it's unlikely that Miss O'Brien could have been saved regardless. So once people observed the nature of her injury, then really that was the end of the story in many ways. So unfortunate, but I thought I'd go through some of those statements and some of the factors that I think a judge would review. I'd be curious to see what the commission's conclusion is on this, if they delve into the evidence to that extent, and see what that looks like when the report comes out in November. All right, so those were two topics today. Video went on a little long. Apologize for that, I guess. But so that was the Michael Hallowes expert testimony on the Alert Ready system, and then some additional analysis of the tragic death of Heather O'Brien. So that's everything for today, and we'll be back tomorrow with an analysis of the Emergency Alert Roundtable. So until then, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.